Now we're going to talk about how plants became such a diverse group and how they were able to colonize land. Plants, like all other forms of life, originated in water in the ocean, and then some plants moved into fresh water, and then from fresh water they moved to land. But this transition from living on water to life on land had some benefits and some challenges. Some of the benefits of living on land is that the sunlight is brighter, you're not blocked by water, you have more access to sunlight. You also have more carbon dioxide in the air than the carbon dioxide that dissolves in water. Plants need carbon dioxide to do photosynthesis. And you also have more minerals in the soil if you can get access to them. Originally, when the rocks on Earth formed, they were not very accessible to plants, but with the help of fungi have been breaking down the soil and making those nutrients available for plants. But there are some challenges of life on land, and these challenges we will also see when we look at how animals colonize land. One obvious challenge is that when you live on water, you have access to water. Everywhere you're surrounded by water. When you live on land, now you don't have water available everywhere, and you have to be very careful about conserving water and avoiding dry out. All living organisms need water, and when you're in land, water becomes a limited resource. Another difference of living in land is that you don't have any support against gravity. When you're on water, water supports your body weight and you can grow large without needing any specialized structures for support. But if you're in land, then gravity is pulling you down and you're going to need specialized structures to hold your body weight. And this is true for plants and for animals. And another big difference is being able to reproduce and disperse without water. For aquatic organisms, they could just release their gametes into the water, and the gametes can swim or drift in the water columns until they find the gametes of the opposite sex and fertilize and be able to produce offspring. But in land, if you just release your gametes into the air, they will quickly dry out and they won't be able to reach very far. So plants and animals had to solve this problem. And also the issue of dispersal. In water, your offspring can then swim or drift in the water columns until they find a new place. But on land, they will likely dry out and run out of nutrients before they can find a suitable new place to settle. Plants had to figure out how to reproduce and how to disperse their offspring without water. So what we will see as we move through the phylogeny of plants in land plants is how they slowly evolve adaptations that made them more and more successful to life on land. So let's look at the plant phylogeny. And we know all plants share a common ancestral with algae. And the first algae to diversify from that ancestor were red algae, then green algae. And so green algae are the closest ancestors of plants today. And one of the closest green algae to plants are the Charophytes. And then after that, we have the first group of plants that colonize land, which are the Bryophytes. These are non-vascular plants, and they include three groups, which we know as liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. And then after the non-vascular plants, we have the appearance of vascular tissues and the evolution of the Tracheophytes. Tracheates is the name for the vascular tissue. Tracheophytes all have vascular tissues, and they start with Lycophytes, which are the club mosses, and then ferns. With ferns, we also have the appearance of true leaves. So this group are called Euphylophytes because they have the first true leaves, including ferns and the group that came after them, which are the seed plants. So after ferns had vascular tissues, but they did not have seeds or pollen. We have the evolution of pollen and seeds in Gymnosperms and Angiosperms. So those are the seed plants. And then in Angiosperms, we have the appearance of flowers and fruits. And Angiosperms are the most abundant group of plants and the most diverse group today although they're very recent, they've been very successful because of their flowers and their fruits. So when we include green algae and what we call plants, all those form a monophyletic group. Plants have a haplodiplontic life cycle. That means they have some tissues or cells that are haploid, that only have one set of chromosomes, and then they have other moments that they are diploid. That means they have two sets of chromosomes, and this is what you see in organisms that reproduce sexually. In sexual reproduction, you have gametes that are haploid that fertilize and form a diploid cell. That diploid cell divides, forming an embryo, which then develops into a sporophyte. This is what we call the diploid structure in plants. That sporophyte produces structures called sporangia, where by meiosis, spores are produced. Since those spores are the result of meiosis, those spores are haploid. Then the spores germinate and develop into a gametophyte, which is haploid. And that gametophyte, since it's already haploid, it produces gametes by mitosis. Since meiosis happened here in the production of the spores, in this case, we see mitosis leading to the production of gametes. This is different to what you see in animals. In animals, meiosis leads directly to the production of egg and sperm. So this gametophyte phase is not present in animals. We go straight from meiosis to producing eggs and sperm. Plants have this additional step of meiosis producing spores, which produce a gametophyte, which then produces gametes by mitosis. So green algae are the most common ancestors of land plants. Some of these green algae can be unicellular, or they can also be multicellular, and they can be the algae that you can see with your naked eyes if you go snorkeling. And algae have a haplodiplontic life cycle, and in most algae, the dominant state is the haploid state. The diploid state might be very brief and might just be one cell. For example, in Chlamydomonas, which is a type of green algae, fertilization of the gametes lead to the only cell that is diploid in the entire life cycle, which is this zygospore. And that zygospore undergoes meiosis, and that will result in the form that the cell will spend its lifetime. They can be positive or negative strains. And then those strains will divide by mitosis, so there will be asexual reproduction. And eventually, when they want to do sexual reproduction, they will combine, and that will be fertilization, leading to the only diploid cell in the cycle. Most algae have a more extended diploid phase. When fertilization happens and the zygote forms, which is the first diploid cell, that zygote develops into a multicellular organism, which is known as a sporophyte. That sporophyte, in its sporangia, produces by meiosis spores, and those spores will grow and develop into the gametophyte. And in most algae, you have male and female gametophytes, or they're sometimes called plus or minors, or type 1 or type 2 gametophytes. Since they're haploid, these gametophytes produce gametes just by mitosis. Those gametes will fertilize, and that will lead again to the diploid stage. Charophytes, which are a group of green algae that lives in fresh water, are the most closely related to the most recent common ancestor of all plants. You will be able to see these charophytes if you look at a freshwater pond. This genus Chara is fairly abundant. So looking at the first plants to colonize land, we have the bryophytes. And since they were the first ones to colonize terrestrial environments, they needed to have some important adaptations to be able to survive on land. But these are non-vascular plants, so they don't have trachyphytes. That means they don't have vessels to transport water and nutrients long distances. All transport has to be by diffusion, so that limits their size, as everything has to move just by diffusion and osmosis. They don't have roots, so this also limits the types of soils they can grow. They don't have leaves, and like we said, they don't have tracheids for movement. And in this group, the gametophyte is still the most dominant stage. And these plants are highly dependent on water. They need to grow in moist environments, but they also need water for fertilization. However, they did develop some important adaptations to land, such as having a cuticle. That cuticle covers the surface of the plant and reduces water loss. They also have a multicellular embryo, which is the main characteristic of land plants. And they have specialized structures called antheridia and archegonia, where the male and the female gametes are produced. These bryophytes come in three different groups: the liverworts, mosses, and the hornworts. So the liverworts are those that diverge earlier on. What you see as the liverwort is the gametophyte. The gametophyte is the dominant generation, and the sporophyte is growing inside of the gametophyte in these structures. And you have male and female gametophytes. The male gametophyte produces sperm that has to swim to the female gametophyte and fertilize it, and that will give rise to the sporophyte. A sporophyte that is completely dependent on the gametophyte. So the sporophyte depends on nutrition and all its needs on the gametophyte, which is the dominant generation. As we move into the mosses, now we have a sporophyte that is actually visible. This structure that stands here, this is the sporophyte, and the gametophyte is the green part, the photosynthetic plant. So here in the mosses, there's still the sporophyte, even though now it's larger and visible. It's still completely dependent on the gametophyte for nutrition. So the gametophyte is the only one doing photosynthesis, and the sporophyte is completely dependent on the gametophyte for food and substance. In hornworts, which is the latest group of the bryophytes, now we see that the sporophyte is actually green. So it is photosynthetic. It's capable of producing some of its own food, although it's still dependent on the gametophyte. So the gametophyte is this leafy looking things here, while the stalks that come out are the sporophytes. The sporophytes are somewhat green, so they are capable of doing some photosynthesis. And another incredible adaptation that we have in the sporophytes is that they have stomata. So stomata are the openings in the leaves that allow plants to regulate water loss so that they can close the stomata, and that prevents water loss. They open their stomata to allow gas exchange, but when they open the stomata, they're also risking water loss. And you can see that still these hornworts are very small. So you can see this picture here for scale on the size of the gametophyte and the stalks that stand out that are the sporophytes. Like we said, in this group of plants, the gametophyte is the dominant part of the cycle. The gametes combining and doing fertilization, and that produces the zygote. The egg was located inside the female gametophyte, and when the sperm fertilizes it, the zygote forms inside the female gametophyte, and it starts to grow and continues to form into the sporophyte while still attached to the female gametophyte. As that zygote grows and develops, it develops into the sporophyte, although always attached to the gametophyte, the parent gametophyte. So you have two different types of generations living together. You have the gametophyte that is haploid, and attached to it is the sporophyte, which is diploid. So two different generations merge together into one organism, sort of. And then in that sporophyte, in the sporangium, you have meiosis producing spores. Those spores then grow and germinate and will give rise to the gametophytes, which is what we see as the bryophyte plant. And then in the gametophyte, in the archegonia for the female gametophyte and the antheridia for the male gametophyte, you'll have the production of gametes. Since the gametophyte is already haploid, the production of gametes happens by mitosis, and then those gametes need to be carried. The sperm in the antheridia needs to be carried to the egg, and the only way this can happen, because the sperm is just a single cell exposed, it needs to be carried by water from the male gametophyte into the female gametophyte. So they are highly dependent on water for their reproduction. And once the sperm reaches the female gametophyte and the egg in the female gametophyte and fertilization happens, the cycle starts again. Next, we have the evolution of vascular tissues. And with the evolution of vascular tissues, we also have the formation of stems and roots and leaves, so we have more specialized structures. Another thing that happens is the sporophyte now becomes the dominant generation. So the evolution of these vascular tissues was very important for the ability of plants to grow into giant sizes. So we have plants that are hundreds of meters tall, and they're able to carry nutrients and water through these extreme heights because of those vascular tissues. So thanks to vascular tissues, plants were able to grow into really tall, really large organisms. Now they no longer rely on osmosis and diffusion to carry water through, although those principles are still very important, and we're going to see in following chapters. Of the first group to branch off from the common ancestor of vascular plants are the Lycophytes, or the club mosses. And these plants, club mosses, they have vascular tissues, they have roots, stems, leaves. The sporophyte is the dominant generation, so this is one that we see here. They still need water for reproduction. They're producing spores in these sections here, and those spores will germinate and form gametophytes, and those gametophytes will produce gametes that will need water. The male gametes will need water in order to be transported to the female gametes. The next group that branches from the vascular plants are the ferns, and ferns are the first ones to be considered to have true leaves. We have ferns in multiple forms, shapes, and ferns were the dominant plants in the Carboniferous time. So if you look at things that we use for fuel like coal, that coal was formed in the Carboniferous time, most likely by plants that were related to the ferns that we see today. And in these ferns, although now the sporophyte is the dominant generation, we still have alternation of generations. So we start with the gametes fertilizing, forming the first diploid cell, which is the zygote, and this is happening inside of the female gametophyte. So the female gametophyte has the egg, and the sperm will travel and find that egg to fertilize it and form the zygote inside of the female gametophyte. That zygote will grow and develop into an embryo. So again, this sporophyte is growing attached to the gametophyte. The sporophyte is developing, and the sporophyte will grow into what we see as the fern. So the part that we recognize as a fern is the sporophyte. The gametophyte is very small, and then that sporophyte, in the bottom of the leaves, it has this sorus or sori. We have multiple. And in each sorus, you have a sporangium that are structures where meiosis is happening, and meiosis is producing spores. So those spores that are produced by meiosis will then grow by mitosis and produce the gametophyte, which is haploid. And the gametophyte will have male and female parts. So the archegonium is the female part, and the antheridium is the male part of the gametophyte. The female part will have the eggs inside, and the male part will produce sperm. And that sperm will have to swim in order to find the egg. So it will need water again in order to be able to swim and find the egg in a female gametophyte. Even though the sporophyte is the dominant generation, you still have a gametophyte generation, you still have a haploid generation, and you're also highly dependent on water. Next in the group, we have the evolution of seeds and pollen. And these are two different things that have very different purposes. So pollen is the reduced version of the male gametophyte. As we keep going up in the phylogeny, we see the reduction of the haploid state in the cycle. And the male gametophyte has now been reduced to just the pollen grain. And this is important because the pollen grain is very small and it's also resistant, so it can be carried by wind. So now you no longer need water to move the male gamete to find and fertilize the female gametophyte and produce the embryo. Now with pollen, you can just have wind or other agents carry the male gametophyte to reach the female gametophyte and have fertilization. So pollen gave plants the complete independence from water. Seeds, on the other hand, form after fertilization happens. So seeds are the way that the embryo gets protected. And they also have a lot of advantages, and they also help plants become independent from water because they protect the embryo and allow the dispersion of the embryo. So that protection protects the embryo from getting dehydrated. It also provides some nutrients to the embryo so it can start developing while it's able to get its own food. And it also allows the ability to introduce a dormant stage so that the seed can wait in that dormant state. The embryo can wait until the conditions are favorable, like let's say there is enough rain so that it can start to develop. So seeds are important for dispersion as well because they allow the embryo to be carried away far away from the parents while being protected. The evolution of pollen, which is primarily the male gametophyte now being able to travel by air or by other agents like insects, as we're going to see in Angiosperms, and the formation of seeds, which is for the protection of the embryo. So the first group that we're going to see that have seeds and pollen are Gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are called naked seeds. So although they have seeds, they're not protected by additional layers as we're going to see in Angiosperms. But they do have seeds which can be dispersed and protect the embryo, and they also have pollen that is mostly carried by the wind, or in some cases it can be carried by other agents, although in Gymnosperms, the most common way of carrying pollen is by wind. So Gymnosperms include things like pines and conifers, and they produce large amounts of pollen because they rely on the wind carrying the pollen from that plant to another plant of the same species that will be able to fertilize that other plant. So they have to produce large amounts of pollen. And that's part of the reason you see the increase in allergies during the springtime, because all these gymnosperms that live on the northern hemisphere are all producing pollen and producing large quantities and all at the same time. And these gymnosperms also have seeds that protect the embryo and allow for dispersion of that embryo. And again, what we see from now on, what the thing that we recognize as the plant, as a pine tree, is the sporophyte. The gametophyte has now been very reduced. In the case of the male gametophyte, it's just the pollen grain. So the gymnosperms that we have are conifers like pine trees. We also have cycads and things like ginkgo and other types of plants that live in quite extreme environments. So the reproductive cycle of these plants, so we're starting with fertilization of the egg and the sperm and the formation of the zygote. This is still happening inside in the female gametophyte, but the female gametophyte in these plants is very reduced, just a few cells, and is all inside. Now, as the gametophyte is dependent on the sporophyte. The zygote is developing inside of the gametophyte, which is just a few cells big, and that gametophyte is dependent on the sporophyte. So now we have 3 generations growing at the same time. That zygote will develop into the seed, and that seed will be carried away to a suitable new area, and then it will develop by mitosis and produce a sporophyte, which is what we see as the pine tree. Then that pine tree is going to produce cones that produce pollen, which produce the male gametophytes, and it produces cones that are ovulating, or that are the ones that will bear the seeds. So in that pollen-bearing cone, you have a microspore mother cell. So instead of having a fully grown sporangium, now it's just a few cells that will be able to divide by meiosis. The same thing in the seed-bearing cones, the megaspore is just a cell that will be able to divide by meiosis and produce the gametophyte that is going to be only a few cells in size. So those microspores that will produce the pollen, that will be the male gametophyte. The female gametophyte is just this megaspore that is only a few cells big. So we have a very dramatic reduction of the gametophytes to just a few cells. Then when the pollen grain reaches the megaspore, that pollen grain produces sperm once it's already in contact with the female gametophyte, and that sperm fertilizes the eggs in the female gametophyte that is now only a few cells big, and that fertilization produces the zygote. And so you can see the complete flip of the cycle where now we have a dominant sporophyte generation or diploid generation, and the haploid generation or the gametophyte has been reduced to just a few cells. And finally, we have the group that have evolved flowers and fruits. So just like pollen and seeds, flowers and fruits have different purposes. Flowers facilitate pollination. So flowers, the main purpose of flowers is to attract insects. These plants figure out that instead of relying on wind and having to produce large amounts of pollen in order to increase their chances that their pollen will go from one plant to the next, they develop a mutualistic relationship with insects where they have insects recruited insects. And in some cases, it's a very specialized relationship where species of insect will only visit a particular species of plant, and will carry pollen from one flower, from one plant to another plant. And this allows plants to have very direct fertilization without having to produce large amounts of pollens and increase the chances of fertilization happen. So they are using insects sort of as their love messengers to carry their pollen from one plant to the next. Fruits, on the other hand, are for seed dispersal. So once the pollen has reached the female flower and fertilized the ovule, and that zygote is formed and starts to develop into a seed, into an embryo that is inside a seed, that seed will then form inside a fruit, and that fruit attracts other animals and allows the dispersion of that seed. So fruits are for the dispersion of the already fertilized egg that is now developed into an embryo and form into a seed, while flowers are for increasing the chances of pollination to happen. So angiosperms are the group of plants that have flowers and have fruits, and they also, like gymnosperms, have a very reduced gametophyte generation. We have an incredible diversity of flowers attracting specific insects, like we said, in multiple ways, providing different kinds of rewards. In some cases, the reward is the pollen itself. In some cases, flowers produce nectar in order to attract the insects, and in some cases, they just trick the insect by pretending that they are a mate for that insect and producing smells that attract the insect, and sometimes might not be offering a reward. And on the other hand, we have fruits that are covering the seeds and allowing the dispersal of those seeds that are the result of an egg that has been successfully fertilized by the sperm carried by a pollen grain. And that zygote has developed into an embryo that is protected inside a seed, and that seed is now inside a fruit. So this is, well, we said gymnosperms were called naked seeds because their seeds are just by themselves. Here in angiosperms, we have seeds that are inside of fruits. Sometimes the fruit might not be very tasty or conspicuous. Sometimes the fruit might just improve dispersal by wind. So you might not see much to it, but that's still a fruit that is allowing dispersal. And just like in gymnosperms, the gametophyte generation has been greatly reduced. We start with eggs and sperm that fertilize and form a zygote, and this zygote is forming inside the female gametophyte, which is only a few cells big. That zygote divides by mitosis, producing an embryo. As the seed starts forming, and when the seed finds the proper place to grow, it starts dividing by mitosis and it forms into an adult sporophyte. That sporophyte produces flowers. Inside those flowers, you have ovaries that produce eggs. And you also have anthers, and inside those anthers, you are producing pollen, microspores that would then produce pollen. The ovule and the megaspore, which are the diploid part, they are part of the sporophyte generation will divide by meiosis, and that will create the megaspore, which is the female gametophyte. And that female gametophyte divides by mitosis and produces the egg. And the megaspore here will divide by meiosis and produce pollen grains, which then divide by mitosis and produce the sperm that would actually fertilize the egg. And so the process, once fertilization happens, you have the formation of the zygote and the process continues. And within Angiosperms, we have the two groups of monocots and eudicots, or monocots and dicots. We're going to talk more about the differences of these two groups in upcoming videos.